Hi ladies and gentlemen, this is video 1, Measures of Development for our unit number 6, Development and Industry. You should take a second to set up your notes to look like this. And the first thing we're going to talk about are types of economic activities. We learned this in our last unit, but this is just going to be a quick review. Remember that primary economic activities are the part of the economy in which these activities revolve around getting raw materials from the earth. So things like farming, fishing, lumbering, or mining. Secondary economic activities deal with processing and manufacturing those raw goods into a finished product, and it has a higher value. So think about it like factories and manufacturing. They can turn lumber into furniture or paper. They could take food and make it into something processed. And the third sector of the economy or economic activity is the tertiary sector. So this sector focuses on moving, selling, and trading products that are made in these primary and secondary sectors. It is service-based. So oftentimes you will hear people talk about the primary sector as agriculture, the secondary sector as industry, and the tertiary sector as service. The tertiary sector is broken down into two subsets. Quaternary economic activities involve information creation and transferring, so they're knowledge-based. They assemble, distribute, and process information. So examples of this are like investment banking, finance, insurance, real estate, marketing. The quinary economic activities involve the highest levels of decision making on a very broad spectrum. So think about things like the government or targeted research, think tanks. So after having explained the three sectors of the economy, think about what does this have to do with development? And if you check out this graph here, the most developed countries are the black line, least developed are the dotted line, and you can see that as of 2000, our most developed countries have a very low amount of primary activities, a medium amount of secondary, and then a really high amount of tertiary or service activities. Whereas that's kind of flipped for our LDCs. LDCs have a very highest amount of their economic sectors focusing on primary activities. Secondary is still in the middle, but tertiary is the lowest. So when we look at these economic sectors, we can tell if a country is more developed or less developed based on where the workforce is distributed. Which one of these sectors of the economy is it in? Okay, so what is development and how do we measure it? Development is growth, and it's not simply a measure of the amount of money a country has or how much it makes. It's economic, social, and demographic factors. So even though development is the process of economic growth or expansion, we have to really look at those social factors as well. Modern notions of development are related to the Industrial Revolution and the idea that technology improves people's lives. And there's actually huge disparities at global, regional, and local scales. So you can see here with Ohio as an example that the counties in the very red are the counties with the most poverty, right? But if we look at it overall, it's mostly blue counties. So we would say the development level in different sections of Ohio, in different counties, is really, there's a large contrast. And it's the same thing here in the United States. So percentage of people living in poverty is found really in this southern area. The highest amount is found in the southern area. But we would still consider the United States a developed country. You can see here that China's poorest provinces are on the western side of the country, and the eastern side of the country is better off. A developing country, remember, is a country where preliminary progress is still being made in technology, production, and socioeconomic welfare. So typically we see low levels of economic productivity, low per capita incomes, and generally low standards of living. And you can also see this map right here. It's the north-south divide, and oftentimes people will use this to show the most developed countries separated from the developing and least developed countries. So there are a lot of ways to measure development. There are two major indicators of development, economic or social welfare, and you should record these down, and we're going to go more in depth with some of them. So some economic indicators, GDP versus GNI, that's where we're going to start off. Gross domestic product is a measure of the total value of the goods and services that are produced by citizens and corporations within a country in a year. And so the formula for GDP is goods plus services equals GDP. If we move down here, this is the equation for GNI, or gross national income. This calculates the dollar value of all goods and services in a country, but it also takes into account the value of exports minus the imports in that same year. So this is a more accurate measure of a country's economic development because it allows for those investments outside of the country to count in the overall statistic. And so the equation here is your GNI equals your goods plus your services plus exports minus imports. So I'll say that again. GNI equals goods plus services plus exports minus imports. So again, the GNI adjusts for the national wealth lost when foreign imports are purchased. It also adjusts for the wealth gained from selling those goods to other countries. Many economists argue that GNI is the more accurate measure of economic value. So let me give you an example of this. Coca-Cola has a production plant in Argentina. However, because Coca-Cola is an American company, its sales of Coke products from the plant in Argentina actually apply to U.S. gross national income. So even though it's being sold and produced in Argentina, it still contributes to our income because it's an American corporation that owns it. There are some disadvantages. It doesn't reflect regional variations in countries. And it also doesn't count the informal economy. And remember, the informal economy is the economy that is not tracked or regulated by the government. So think about like the black market, drug trade, street vendors, agriculture and housekeepers that are getting paid under the table, construction workers that are getting paid under the table, babysitting. I'm sure a lot of you babysit, but you may not get taxed on that money. So anything that isn't reported to the government. This also includes things like human trafficking and prostitution. The last thing I want to mention is you might see this this measure talked about as per capita, and this means per person. So to find this, if I wanted to find GDP per capita, I would take the equation I was just given and divide it by the total population. So in MDCs, GDP per capita is greater than $20,000. In LDCs, the GDP per capita is less than $1,000. And so remind yourselves, these numbers are not indicators of personal income or average salaries of people. They're basically a measure of the country as a collective and the wealth that could be distributed. So it indicates this relative standard of living, but it is not really, when we say per person, each person's income. Okay, so some other economic indicators. Distribution of the workforce. I talked about this a little bit when we were talking about economic activities, but remember that MDCs are concentrated in tertiary activities, whereas LDCs are focused on primary. And so you can see these two examples here. This example is the United States. 1.5 to 1.6% of our economy is made up of agriculture, 16.5% is industry, and services are about 81 to 82%. Whereas compared to India, you can see that the light blue is much bigger here. India, agriculture makes up 49.7% of the economy. Industry makes up 21.5%, and services make up 28.7%. Another way to measure development is energy consumption per capita. And so it's really high in MDCs and really low in LDCs. And this makes sense because in a less developed country, there is less infrastructure, right? So there aren't power lines and electric lines. There isn't Wi-Fi or internet access. They don't have phone lines. So when we're using energy, we're also using fossil fuels as well to create that energy. So they kind of go hand in hand. You can see here on this chart that Canada and US are really high on this energy consumption per capita, whereas these less developed countries down here are very, very low. Okay, purchasing power parity. This is the adjustment that is made to GNI to account for differences among countries in the cost of goods. So for example, if a resident in one country has the same income as a resident in another country, but they have to pay more for groceries, shoes, anything that they need to buy, the resident in country B is much better off, right? So it takes into account the different prices of goods and the cost of living. Think about it. Houses in Ohio are much, much cheaper than the exact same house in California because the standard of living and the cost of living is different. It's the same thing with other countries when we're considering development. So another example, in the US, a loaf of bread costs $2.21, but in China, it only costs $1.63. So in China, the GNI per capita is about $4,270, but this does not represent the true value. When we adjust it for purchasing power parity, then it goes up to $8,390 per capita, and that represents the actual value of the purchasing power. So this is another image that can help you. How many bananas can you buy for $5? And so we would need to adjust the PPP between Australia and Ethiopia. Okay, so let's talk about social welfare and demographics. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the Human Development Index. This is published by the UN in 1990, and it's to track and assess global development. And it's explained right here, and you can see the choropleth map here. So it factors in 4 things to assess a country's level of development. Number 1 is GDP per capita. Number 2 is adult literacy rates. Number 3 is the average level of education in that country. And number 4 is the total life expectancy. So you can see that right here, life expectancy, years of schooling, and GDP. And so the scale is 0 to 1, and the higher the number that you have, the more developed you are. And so you can see here that most of Western Europe, the United States, Canada, and Australia are considered highest on the Human Development Index. And this was created to emphasize that people and their capabilities should be the ultimate criteria for assessing the development of a country, not economic growth alone. This HDI can also be used to question national policy choices, asking how 2 countries with the same GNI can end up with different human development outcomes. And this can really stimulate debate about what should the policies and priorities of a government be. The Human Development Index is a summary measure of this average achievement in things that are important to development. So, do you live a long and healthy life? Are you knowledgeable and educated? And do you have a decent standard of living? Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about is Gender Inequality Index. Gender inequality is a major barrier to human development. Girls and women have made so much progress since the 1990s, but we do not see gender equality across the world. The disadvantages really facing women are things like discrimination in health, education, political representation, and the workforce. And these really have negative consequences for the development and capabilities of a society. So the GII measures the cost of that gender inequality. And so the higher the GII value, the worse off that women are in that society. And so it's measured by three things: reproductive health, empowerment, and participation in the labor force. So empowerment just means the ability of women to achieve